All right, welcome to Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg. So glad to be talking today. It is Wednesday. Yeah, hump day. Always a good day for me. Always looking forward to the weekend, and should be fun going to get together with an old friend over the weekend, taking some basketball. So I am definitely looking forward to that. I was also just sort of moving my head around just to see how smooth the motion was on the OBS software that I use, because I was fiddling around. I should never do that before a program, but just playing around with some settings and wanted to make sure everything was smooth. I think it's working okay. All right, today's program, by the way, well, there's going to be several different topics. I was actually watching one of my least favorite, I don't want to say, somebody I don't really appreciate nearly as much as many do. That would be Kyle Kulinski. But one thing he did, I was watching his video yesterday, I was saying, I'm just as good as that guy is. Probably a lot of you would disagree, or people who certainly watch him would disagree, and there are many more that watch him than me, of course. But I was like, yeah, but one thing he does that I do appreciate is he kind of lets you know in advance. I think some of the other hosts do, the topics that they're going to be getting to. So today's program does certainly, through the title, give you some information. And it's not anything brand new in terms of a theme. That is the problematic nature of today's Democratic Party. Can it be redeemed? So that's going to be a major topic, and I'm actually going to bring into it the discussion, the opinions as expressed by recently, in the past few days, of folks I would call progressive, certainly Kulinski foremost among them, but also, much to my disappointment, Jacobin Magazine, which has not been a true leader in terms of the resistance that I want to see. And when I say resistance, I don't mean resist Trump. I mean resist the unitary party, resist militarism, resist neoliberalism, resist genocide. And that means resist both major American political parties, because they're both complicit. They're both responsible in large part for where we are right now, which is a dark place, notwithstanding the piece by Nick Kristof that Arlen and I discussed, which said, hey, things are great. This is the best time to ever be alive. Maybe in some very narrow sense, that's true. But if you look at our trajectory, it's like a parabola or a roller coaster. And maybe some of the metrics are still going up, but I believe, based on the what we're seeing, what we read about, the information that we have about the planet as we're heading deeper and deeper into this sixth grade extinction, as we're heading deeper and deeper into an overpopulated planet with massive wealth and income inequality, with massive wealth and power inequality between and within countries. I cannot see us things going, in a positive direction, notwithstanding what Kristof might have to say. And I was saying the very reasonable, argument, the persuasive even argument he presents. So again, today's program will start with the problems with the Democratic Party, why, in my opinion, it's not redeemable, why those who present some of the errors, as they would describe it, or mistakes, as they would describe it, that the Democratic Party made, in my view, are simply features. That is who the Democratic Party is. They didn't miscalculate when they campaigned with Liz Cheney. They didn't miscalculate when they insisted that they were not going to ever break with Israel. That's who they are. And pretending or arguing or presenting a case that the Democratic Party can, just didn't make some important decisions at the right time. For example, it's like a football game. They went to throw a pass when they should have run the ball. No, they are the party of genocide. They are a party of wealth and income inequality. They are a party of genocide. I say they're part of the party of genocide. So that's what we'll talk about. Probably the main feature of today's program. But I also want to get into, on a local level or a state-based level, how the Democratic Party, even in, dark blue, maybe California, although I guess it's not quite as dark blue as it used to be. The party there has failed its residents, and the defenses offered for it just are so hollow that they just don't ring persuasive in any way. And we may or may not get to a discussion of sex and gender and whether they are on, certainly with respect to sex, whether it's on a spectrum. Certainly I agree that gender, is persuasively, certainly there's a strong case that gender's on a spectrum. In other words, that some of us are very masculine, some of us are very feminine, and then in between, there's quite a range. And I think that's probably true. Sex is a little different. Basically, you're either biologically male or biologically female, with a few exceptions. Do those exceptions constitute a spectrum, or are they simply a list of various ways, and not that many ways, given that there are billions of people on the planet, maybe a few dozen different ways that human sexuality can be expressed in organisms. So we'll hopefully get to all of that. 240-242-5646 if you want to join me at any time. And I am pleased that I tested, and in fact, the ringer does work. Let me just again remind you, as I did yesterday, we do have our little GIF here, our Facebook GIF that I put together. So if you want more Halitics after the program's over or during the program, join us on Facebook. Join Halitics on Facebook. And I also will urge you, please do subscribe if you haven't yet done so. We need you. I need you. I want you to subscribe. The more people who subscribe, the more distribution we get. It snowballs. More and more people see this program, hear what I have to say. I think it's worth hearing. So, that's why I do this. And finally, your last request I'm going to make at this point, my last request of you, I should say, is click that like button. More likes, more subscribe. Even if you haven't subscribed, you can, or if you have subscribed, you can like. And if you haven't liked, you can subscribe, or vice versa, or however that works. But all of that certainly does help. Again, last request, I guess, 240-242-5646. That number is always going to be on, or almost always on your screen. Only when I'm live, of course. And you can see, I think, when you're listening, watching, whether I'm live, so you'll know whether you can call in and get a response or not. Let's start with Jacobin. I've actually got, I guess it's not sure what the right word is. A full disclosure, I have submitted some pieces to Jacobin, and I once got a very, very nice rejection from them, and otherwise they just completely ignore me. But I'm pretty frustrated because I think they should publish me. But I think the reason they haven't is mainly because I don't have, they like to view themselves as Jacobin as a scholarly outpost of progressive, where the most, elite thinkers on the left, elite, professors at top institutions, thought leaders, that kind, former politicians, PhDs, right? If I had a PhD in something, I'm a lawyer, maybe if I wrote about law, maybe, I don't know, if I had, some big case that they thought was interesting, but generally they're just not going to publish me, and I'm irritated by that. I think they should. I think my message is not one that they're fully embracing. My message that we must forsake the Unitary Party. This column, I think, makes the case we need to forsake the Unitary Party, but it doesn't actually go there, right? I mean, the evidence they present suggests strongly to me that we need to move to the Green Party or to some other emerging party. But that's not where they go. So Democrats helped bring about Trump's return. And they make a very strong case. Of course they did. How could they not have? It was a binary choice, right? I mean, that's how everyone saw it. It's either the Republicans or the Democrats. Well, obviously, if the majority of voters or the plurality of voters voted for Trump, and that's why he won, then obviously it had to be the Democratic Party helped bring it about, right? I mean, it was, if the Democratic Party had done everything right, then the women you see on that screen would be large and in charge right now. And I say women because I don't think there's any question that Liz Cheney would have played a very prominent role in a Harris administration. And that's part of the problem. That is the problem. That's why people aren't going to vote for Democrats, because they don't want a neocon president. They don't want a neoliberal agenda. They don't want a woke party that doesn't concern itself with the challenges that are facing working people. That's not what Americans want. Now, you could say, well, they got it anyway, or they got a lot of that from Trump. And I'd say, okay, but the Democratic Party presented itself as a party, or has presented itself in the past as a party of working people. And it's without question, and you can see it in that picture, how comfortable Kamala has already said this during the campaign. This is in the latest Jacobin, how comfortable she was with Liz Cheney, how comfortable today's Democratic Party is. That is who this party is. So I thought that image was extremely powerful, and that's why it's presented. I see Shade saying, let it go. There are important issues to worry about, such as whether our democracy will survive the fascist Trump regime. Well, of course, that's exactly why we're discussing this. If you want us to reclaim the vestiges of democracy that we once enjoyed, and by the way, that were lost long before Trump. The idea that we were a democracy before Trump and we aren't now clearly reflects a misreading of where we are. Democracies don't support genocide. That is not what the American people wanted. Democracies don't engage in proxy wars half a world away that the American public doesn't want. Democracies don't have for-profit healthcare system that bankrupts 500,000 citizens every year and kills many others. That's not a democracy. And that is why Trump prevailed. So if you want to survive Trump, if you want to move on from Trump, then we need to come up with a strategy that will appeal to people. And that strategy it clearly will not work if you are trying to simply hearken back to the good old days of Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. That is not what people want. And what also people don't want is the kind of, I think, mealy-mouthed, ineffective media that supposedly is progressive, supposedly is on the left, that is working class based, but fails to recognize, fails to acknowledge that the Democratic Party is no longer an ally, cannot be an ally, and is now irredeemable. So here you see from the Jacobin piece that just came out just a few days ago, focusing on Joe Biden and in an act of bipartisanship, naming two new aircraft carriers, the Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. I can't think of two people who, I don't know, maybe an aircraft carrier, I guess it's a weapon of war, it's a weapon of destruction. I would name, maybe if I had a pet rat, right? Maybe if I had two rats, maybe one would be Clinton and one would be Bush. I don't know. That might be a possibility, something of that nature, but certainly not, these billion-dollar boats that are floating out there with airplanes landing on them. So what the Jacobin author says is that by naming these carriers Clinton and Bush, what Biden is doing is conveniently erasing Bush's deeply controversial legacy. Now, I wouldn't use the word controversial. I would say sinister, malevolent, evil, monstrous. Those are better words to describe George W. Bush's legacy than controversial. He countenanced torture. He took power through a Supreme Court decision that flouted democracy, going back to that question. Well, give it up. We have to protect our democracy is the argument. You can't protect it if you are trying to re-empower an undemocratic Democratic Party. Bush's legacy is a terrible legacy. It's one that Joe Biden certainly endorsed. He supported probably the worst thing W did, the worst thing the U.S. has done, well, and maybe until the genocide in this millennium, which is to destroy Iraq. Destroy one of the more advanced, if I can use that term, Arab countries. Women were doctors. Women drove. It was a secular state. They didn't. Yes, there were problems. Yes, it was bad. Yes, he was a tyrant, Saddam, but better there than Saudi Arabia. Bush just destroyed all that based on lies. So that's not a controversial legacy. That's a monstrous one, and it's one that Joe Biden has to share in. He sheepdog votes by W's war on the people of Iraq. Of course he would name an aircraft carrier after him. He had no problem with that. So to go on to this, through this Jacobin piece that, again, is so misguided, as though the Democrats are just, well, they're making a few little mistakes, like maybe they shouldn't name an aircraft carrier after a controversial president. Well, that's who they are. Of course they will. They support what W did. And they go on to say that these gestures reveal their willingness to play by a different set of rules than their opponents, right? Which is basically that they'll give credit to Republicans, that they'll make common cause with Republicans, which I'm not sure isn't considered. If they're Jabin saying, well, that's a good thing. We should reach across the aisle. But they also say it fails to engage with a class-based failure. Hey, we're all in it together, people over party, America over party. But that kind of bipartisanship where you work with Liz Cheney and you name an aircraft carrier after W is really, according to the Jacobin, a fig leaf covering the party's deeper failure to engage with the class-based de-alignments that made Trump's victory possible in the first place. So the de-alignment is that the working class is no longer in any way a part of the Democratic coalition. It is no longer aligned with the Democratic Party. And according to this author, I think his name is Maskram, I'll get you that in a second, that is, they failed, David Moskrop, they failed, the Democrats have failed to engage with that de-alignment. They haven't failed at all. That's just false. Remember, even, was it in 2016, when Chuck Schumer said, hey, we don't need those blue-collar voters. We don't need those working-class voters. We can make them up in the suburbs. So they got it. They knew that there was a de-alignment. They knew they were losing working-class voters. They didn't care. They were like, we don't care if we want to embrace the country club set. We want to be a party of billionaires. We want to be a party of Wall Street. We want to be a party of the military-industrial complex of the weapons makers. And that's the party we are. We are. Now, we're not saying that Republicans aren't that party too, but that's who we are. So they absolutely engaged it, and they, in fact, embraced it. So Moskrop gets this completely wrong. He makes an assumption that the Democratic Party, well, they just sort of made some bad decisions. They didn't really understand that what they were doing was alienating working class voters. No, they're perfectly happy to alienate them. They don't want to. Those workers are dirty. Their hands are grimy. They have funny ways of speaking. They don't have good manners. That's why the Democratic Party forsook them. They don't have money. That's why the Democratic Party forsook them. Nothing to do with being clueless or misunderstanding, nothing like that. It was a calculated decision that the leadership in the party made because it was in and continues to be in their own best self-interest to be with the billionaires. Look at how well it worked out for Barack Obama. Look at how well it's worked out for the Clintons. Of course they're going to do that. It may not work out well for you. It may not work out well for rank and file Democrats who don't get elected, who lose elections. But if you're the one driving the bus, you're driving it to Martha's Vineyard, you're driving it to Hawaii, you're having a hell of a time. And that's why the Democrat Party is what it is, not a Democratic Party, not a party of the people, not a working class party. And it never will be again. It is time long past to move to a different place. If you care about our democracy, if you want our democracy to come back to the extent we once had one, maybe we sort of did. We sort of did in the 30s when the party of FDR actually pursued pro-working people policies. We sort of had a democracy in some ways in the 1960s when the party of LBJ embraced civil rights. There were, you can point to plenty of counterexamples like the war in Vietnam, which LBJ didn't want, which he knew it was a mistake. He knew it was wrong, but he made a deal with the devil to go ahead and pursue war in Vietnam in return for civil rights. And that was, I can't fault him for that deal, but obviously it was a very, very high price to pay for something that we absolutely needed to have. All right, 240-242-5646, 240-242-5646. We have a new commenter, Faith Bad. This what Jill Stein wanted. I'm not sure, are you saying, I want the Green Party? I'm not sure, Faith Bad, if you're saying that she wanted Trump to win. I don't know. She said she didn't. I don't know whether she thought about it that way. I didn't go there in terms of wanting one or the other. They're both bad. They're both awful. The two options were terrible. Jacobin needs to be a leader. We need institutions, even a small, relatively low, obviously, distribution institution like Jacobin to be a full-throated supporter, endorser of alternative emerging parties. And they don't do it. They never mention. They tell you how bad the Democratic Party is. They tell you that the Democratic Party's embrace of the Cheneys, Democratic Party's failure to recognize or to engage in the de-alignment is why we got Trump, which they obviously view as a horrible thing. But they don't go to the next step, which is, okay, we need to move in a different direction. So instead they say, once the Democrats accept that embracing Liz Cheney, once they accept that supporting foreign adventures isn't the path to electoral success, the healing can begin. And the Democrats could find a path to political renewal and an actual chance of victory. Well, that's the fantasy, right? That's the fantasy that the Democrats don't know exactly what they did wrong. They know if they don't think it was wrong, though. They know what they did that cost them the election. They don't care. Better to lose to Trump than to give up the enormous financial support we get from the weapons manufacturers and the oil and gas industry and Wall Street and Hollywood and Silicon Valley. Now, I know many of those people, Silicon Valley, they blow with the wind. They're with Trump right now because he won. But they gave millions and millions and millions. Mark Cuban, millions of dollars, just wrote checks. Right? Oprah, right? I know she took money, but she also, I'm sure, she gave a lot too. So that's who the Democrat Party is. And the idea, it's a fantasy if you think it's anything but the billionaire party. Now, so is the Democrats. So is the Republicans. Both of them are. I guess Faith Bad doesn't like the Green Party. Hey, Faith Bad, call in and tell me why you don't like the Green Party if you want. 240-242-5646. So again, talking about institutions on the so-called left, like Jacobin, that are failing us. I really was sort of intrigued by what Kyle Kulinski, I forget what his he calls his program, but his take, because he does address it, his take on why Kamala lost. He talks about that poll that I focused on quite a bit last week, which is she lost because she embraced Israel, because she embraced genocide. Because at no time was she willing to say, no, we're not going to support endless killing in the Middle East by Israel. Here's Kulinski.
It's surprising. I actually agree with that. And the reason I agree with that is because to this point, there's...
All right, so I just want to say, what he agrees with is that it's surprising that, it's surprising to many that it was Gaza. It was the support for Gaza that cost Harris the election. He's saying that's surprising. And he'll continue to explain why he thinks that.
Data to indicate that Gaza was like one of the main reasons why Kamala Harris lost, right? And it's been notably absent from my diagnosis of the situation because I just simply could not empirically back up the claim. It's something...
All right, let me stop it right there for a second. So I've been talking about this from the beginning, and I made, shown both sides, the argument certainly that by embracing Israel, by failing to ever even mention a way that she might break with Israel, Harris alienated, obviously pro-Arab, pro-Palestine voters, especially in Michigan, but also she drove away young voters. She failed to engage many, many voters, including seniors, including middle-aged people who just don't want to see us supporting that kind of horrible atrocity. And I've talked about that since pretty much the day after the election and talked about it with Chris Van Hollen. If you recall, we played the clip where he talked about this to me. He responded to my question. So Kulinski didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to say it was Gaza. You heard it from me long before, which is a good reason to watch my videos before you watch his. But now he's reckoning with it, so good for him. Here we go.
Being honest, I wanted it to be true. You want to feel like, hey, the mass slaughter of innocent people overseas with our money and our weapons, that matters, and that's bad. Like, I wanted it to be the case, but I didn't have the evidence to make that.
So point. Here's what he completely misses. This is where Kulinski completely is off the rails. He's saying, well, I wanted the reason for her to lose, not to have been the woke stuff, not to have been because Americans are racist or xenophobes, they hate immigrants. I didn't want that to be the reason. I wanted the reason to be people did not vote for Kamala Harris in significant part because she supported genocide without any reservations, without any questions. He's saying, I wanted that to be the reason, and now it appears very possibly it was the reason. Where he misses the point is that's why she shouldn't have been president. It's not just that people had a reason that he accepts for not voting for her. It's that reason should have kept you from voting for her. That reason should have kept you from flacking for her instead of going on your stupid show every friggin' 3 times a day and telling everyone how they have to vote for Harris and how terrible Trump is and Trump is this and Trump is that. No, this is why you should have been calling for people to vote for Jill Stein, whom you supposedly endorsed in a video that she floated that clearly did not contain your endorsement, that you didn't endorse. But this is the point you missed, Kalinsky. You knew how bad she was on Gaza, on Israel. You knew that she's a monster, and yet you kept telling people to vote for her. And you still don't get that this is why you shouldn't have done that.
So I never made that claim, and my analysis was always on other things, right? But this is a big piece of evidence now. So they continue. The top reason those non-voters cited above the economy at 24% and immigration at 11% was Gaza. Wow.
All right, I'll stop it there. I got a little more I want to play from him because he gives some other argument, why she might have lost. But at no point does Kalinsky say, well, this is who the party is. Well, we'll get to that. So, but he doesn't ever say, okay, well, let's move in a different direction. It's time to say bye-bye to the Democratic Party. And so all of this is just window dressing. It doesn't really matter. He's saying, oh, you're going to lose elections if you don't, move away from genocide. But you won't lose me. I'm still going to support you. Maybe for some people that's a good enough reason, and I accept that it's an okay reason because after all, we don't want to just watch innocent people get slaughtered, and you enabled that. But I'll still be there for you. Wow. Real brave there.
This point, I literally think we have, in hindsight, our perfect answers about this election. That, number one, if Kamala genuinely and sincerely broke with Biden on Gaza, that would have helped her colossally. Would it have been enough to get her over the edge? That's debatable. We can't know that for sure. But would it have helped her? It absolutely would have helped her. So imagine a world where, number one, Kamala actually did break with Biden and did say, we're going to cut off their weapons because they're violating the Leahy law. They're breaking international law, so we can't send them weapons because that's what the law is, right? That's what the law in the U.S. is. If she had said that, that would have helped her massively. And then the other things, of course, that I always come back to, if Biden was able to get through the original Build Back Better bill. So in other words, if Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin didn't torpedo the original Build Back Better bill, that's another thing I think for sure the Democrats would have won and Kamala would have won. Because remember, that original bill had paid family leave, childcare, universal pre-K, free community college. It expanded Medicare. It had a higher minimum wage. It lowered all prescription drug prices, not just some of them. And it expanded the child tax credit. So imagine a world where Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin fell in line because Biden fought for it. We got the original Build Back Better passed. And imagine a world where Kamala broke with Biden on the issue of Gaza. I think in that scenario, I think there's no way she loses.
All right, so I can imagine anything, right? I could imagine a world where everyone gets a pink pony. But that's Kalinsky's fantasy world. That's not a real world. The Democratic Party is not a world where a pro-peace, anti-genocide candidate becomes the nominee. Look at how they torpedo Bernie at every opportunity. That's not who the Democratic Party is. The Democratic Party is not a party that champions lower drug costs. It may throw a few drugs into a negotiating panel for pricing because it's the very, very least it feels it must do. It must do that to keep some patina of working class cred. Of consumer cred. But that's not who the party is. So your imagination is running completely wild. That's not who they are. And for you to claim that, or for you to say that, or to suggest that that's even plausible is fantasy land. but it pays you well. You have a lot of Democrats, obviously, who subscribe to your channel. It's the numbers apparently have gone way up for Kulinski. You know, they have gone up. I've seen that. And I guess you got invited to parties, and now you and Crystal can hang out with, you know, I guess the squad and Marianne Williamson, who's a Democrat, never broke with the Democratic Party. Maybe that's what you get out of it. But that's not what working people get out of it. They get nothing. They get nothing from your embrace of this genocidal party. All right, the nation. Now, I want to say something else, because obviously, you know, there's this idea, well, you're going after the Democrats, Trump's in power, Trump's so bad. Of the assumption, the basic assumption of this program, unless I talk about specific exceptions, is that Trump is really bad. The Republicans are really bad. The policies that they push are going to hurt most Americans. Now, there are a few, you know, exceptions that I've mentioned. At least we sort of have a ceasefire in Gaza, and that's a little better, or it's a little less awful for the Gazan people today than it was last week when Joe Biden was president. That is true. That is true. But that doesn't mean it won't get bad again, or as bad as it was, or worse. It could. I wouldn't be surprised. But it's also really bad. But even if you say, okay, yeah, it's a little better in Gaza, which is really good, you know, it's really better. That's, thank God, you know, we're glad people aren't being killed right now as we speak with bombs. Maybe they are falling on their heads. But on the other hand, Israel's conducting pogroms in the West Bank. So that's really bad. So, you know, even that, Trump gets a little tiny bit of credit, but also not very much. On Ukraine, I'm hoping that we get peace there. So there are a few areas, but, you know, unbalanced, Trump's awful. No defense for Trump. The point of this program is, how do we defeat Trumpism, Republicanism, and corporate democratism? And some would say, well, you're not just going after corporate Dems, you're going after all Dems. They all are corporate. That's why. Even the ones who don't raise money. I saw some fundraising meme by AOC. Well, I don't raise money from PACs. Yeah, but you give money to corporate Dems. Yeah, but you vote along with your squad mates for the Congress member from Wall Street and Israel to be your leader. So what does it matter if you take money from restaurant workers and factory workers, and if there are any in your district, and you know, secretaries? So what? You just take their money, but you still betray them. You still stab them in the back. I don't see how you get credit for that, AOC. Right. So from John Nichols, this is an older piece. The pieces I was talking about earlier in the program from Jacobin, the clip from the clips, well, it was from one show of Kulinski. Those are, you know, within the past week. They're very, very recent. This is right after the election. John Nichols, who was constantly, he was out there on programs. He was on Hartman talking about how we have to elect Harris, how Trump is an existential threat. But then he writes this piece, Liz Cheney was an electoral fiasco. So he's saying the reason that she lost, Harris lost, is because she embraced Liz Cheney. I think that was a factor. I agree with him there. And he would know better than I would. He was out there on the trail, so he saw what it did. But he looked at some polling and everything, and here's what he has to say. Every day of the election campaign, you know, she didn't have enough time. That's one of the arguments. I think that the less time she had, the better. The less people got to know Kamala Harris, the better for Kamala Harris. Every day was precious, and every signal sent was significant. The days spent with Cheney, and those were the 2-3 weeks just before the election, sent a signal to potential Dem voters about the Iraq War and other Cheney projects, that's where she was. That's where her heart was, right? In war. In a devastating, incredibly destructive war that killed maybe 1 million people, that made us so much less safe, that ruined so many lives. And even even in America, where we had very few casualties directly, although some, right, they're not de minimis, but there were few. Even in America, the war destroyed many, many families, parents, moms, dads, kids on deployment after deployment, endless deployment, Americans torturing other people. You don't think that creates a psychic wound in our country that we have torturers among us? Of course it does. So that was a message that Harris sent, was that she embraces that mindset. And the other problem that Nichols identifies, and I think it is, obviously it was a problem, that was time she could have spent in union halls and working class communities. She could have been with Sean Fain and Bernie Sanders. She could have been with Tim Walz, who had, real cred. So those are fair points. But here's where he totally misses the boat. We'll continue it. Let me just continue, because this is really where I think Nichols totally misunderstands. And maybe he really does misunderstand. Maybe he is naive. He says that was time when she was with Cheney that Harris could have spent talking to Arab Americans whose vote they lost, right? Students and others about Gaza whose votes they lost. They could have reached out to Latino communities whose votes they almost lost. And then he goes on to say, and every minute that Harris spent with Liz Cheney was wasted. Okay. That presupposes, that statement is that she wishes, or she wanted to, or she had to choose between having those difficult conversations with Arab American students and others about God. She didn't want to have those conversations. She didn't want to talk to them. She met once and she said, gave them nothing. She said, we're all in for Israel, and that's the end of it. So your comment, it's completely fails Nichols to grapple with the reality, which is the Democratic Party is not about victims. It's not about trying to help those harmed by American policy. It's not about trying to change policy so that traditionally marginalized groups, individuals who are being bombed or persecuted, it's not about trying to help them out. It's basically about trying to, just get over on them, on those people, to argue, well, you think I suck? Well, look at the other guy. And to rub elbows with rich people, powerful people, people who can do you favors, whether you're in office or out of office. So that time that Kamala Harris spent with Liz Cheney wasn't, from her perspective, wasted. That time that Kamala Harris spent with Liz Cheney wasn't, from her campaign's perspective, wasted. It was just time that, she was, making herself in many ways more appealing, more attractive to the billionaire class. It's true, she lost the election, and I'm sure she wanted to win, but, there was a plan B, and this accomplished that. All right, 240-242-5646, 240-242-5646. I was reminded when I watched this story of just how bad things were, and just how badly Los Angeles County and the state of California screwed up those fires down in LA area. I was reminded when I watched this clip, which I'll play for you in a little bit, but it also brought to my mind what I showed you yesterday from a California political activist. They wrote in this incredibly, I think, immature piece, safe from watching a convicted felon rapist dangle his tiny hand in the vicinity of a Bible. So, march safe, and then they go on to say that they're grateful that they live in California, thank goodness, where they're protected from people like Trump. So that's the kind of like, yes, I live in a blue state, we're better, right? That's a real sort of in my opinion, it's very sanctimonious, it's self-righteous, But it also is incredibly tone deaf and wrong-headed when you look at what actually California has done, at least with respect to the biggest story in the state right now, which is the terrible fires in Los Angeles. So let's play this clip. This is today. This isn't like last week's news. This is today.
Now to the investigation of LA County's emergency alert system.
So it appears that many people in Altadena, they got the alert about the Eden fire, but it may have come too late. NBC4's Michelle Vyas live in Altadena mapping out the timeline of when those alerts were issued, coming out, and now all of it is under review, Michelle.
So the news, yes, is that in Altadena, which we've talked about, a traditional middle-class community with a significant African-American population going back 60 years now, was very, very badly devastated by the Eaton fire. And what made that fire even more destructive in Altadena is the fact that the Los Angeles County failed to provide sufficiently early warning to some of the residents of Altadena. So let's listen to Michelle Vallis here.
Morning.
Good morning. I already heard from one resident who said, why wasn't all of Altadena evacuated? We're back here in Altadena this morning where 17 of those deaths in the Eaton fire happened west of Lake Avenue.
All right, so remember that. We really have to highlight that. The deaths, 17, were all west. I think those were all the residents of Altadena who died. All of them were west of Lake Avenue, which is a dividing line in Altadena.
Morning, and we now have just learned that that is a neighborhood that didn't receive any electronic alerts until 9 hours after the fire started, and now an investigation into why. We want to show you this map put together by the public broadcasting system. They, along with TV stations like NBC4, work together to help notify the public when there is an emergency like a wildfire evacuation. The next map shows the first alert on the night of January 7th that went out at 6:48 p.m., just 30 minutes after the Eaton fire started. That was for the east side of Altadena East.
So remember, 30 minutes after the fire starts, East Altadena gets alerts on their phones, right? You get a notice on your phone. Now, some people might not have a phone, they might not have it on, but you have kids in your house, one of them's going to get that alert. You have your spouse, your spouse is maybe at work, they're going to call you up and say, it's 6:48. Let's say they're working late, whatever, or they have a night shift. They're going to call you up and they're going to say, we got to get out of the house right now. This is right after, 30 minutes after the fire starts. That's East Altadena, east of Lake. The western side of that city did not get its alert for another 8+ hours.
Closest to where the fire is believed to have started. The third map showing the first time people in
9 hours later, 6:48, it goes to the east side, the alerts. 6:48 p.m., 3:25 a.m., over almost 9 hours later, the alert goes to the west side of Altadena.
That neighborhood west of Lake got an electronic alert. That was at 3:25 a.m., 9 hours after the fire started. The neighborhoods in between, to our knowledge, did not get an evacuation warning. We also want to point out that this morning there are 17 deaths connected to the Eaton fire, all coming from the west side of Altadena. All
right, so you can see the road right down the middle kind of going north-south. You can see the blue markers where the deaths are, all where the alert did not go out for 9 hours after the fire began, and almost 9 hours after the original alert went to the eastern side of the city.
Neighborhoods that didn't get an electronic evacuation warning until the middle of the night, when many were probably sleeping, perhaps didn't know, turn off their phone. Some quite possibly, and I know of one, didn't even have a cell phone. So many of us recall the evacuation order error that went out to all of LA County during the Kenneth fire. That was for the Sherman Oaks and Woodland Hills area. But there was also a second evacuation alert sent out in error the next morning. We got calls into our news.
So she's just talking about some other, they were false positives as well. In Altadena, they told you had to evacuate way too late, at least on the west side of the town, west of Lake. So that was a false negative. In other words, they did not send out alerts when they should have. This is the LA County emergency response system. At the same time, after the fires had been burnt out, put out, or they were no longer a danger, they were sending out more alerts. And that's a huge problem too, because then people get on the roads and they evacuate. You have more traffic, and it makes it more difficult for the response teams to address the areas that still need assistance. So huge F up by Los Angeles County. Now, I try to give people the benefit of the doubt. I don't know exactly why this happened. We're going to play a little more from the clip. But if you're going to say, oh, I'm so glad I live in California, my gosh, so much better than the red part of this country that voted for Trump, at least we're in a good space. You got to reckon with this kind of screw up. And there's a patina, there's a significant racial component to it. I keep talking about East-West. You may have figured out, yeah, the west side of town, where the deaths occurred, where the alert was delayed by 9 hours, that's the African-American side of town.
People from Long Beach, people from the IE were calling in about that one. And even LA County Supervisor Catherine Barger was talking about an alert she received, she and her husband, that happened days after the fire. That was an evacuation warning when repopulation efforts were happening. So definitely a lot of confusion, but she says the board is committed to accountability and also transparency and is expecting the results of that review within 90 days. All
right. So again, look, these things happen. I don't want to, I'm sure they were just overwhelmed. I'm not here to condemn, the LA County response teams. They do need to obviously investigate what happened, just like they have to investigate why when they turn on hydrants there's no water, why one of the reservoirs had been drained at a time when there were very high risk of fires, because that is also part of the story. I just think this is kind of the reason why you don't brag about how great your state is, because it didn't go for Trump. I just think that when this is going on, you maybe you'll lay a little bit low. You don't say, oh, we're so much better than those chuckleheads in, Kansas. I note one other point. This is a story from this morning. So this isn't like I'm going back to last week. This is right now in Los Angeles.
Of course, keep you posted and updated. In Altadena this morning, Michelle Valles for Today.
All right, and I was going to stop, but I called her Valles. I'm sorry, Valles. I was going to end the clip there. I wasn't playing it, but I wanted to play it because the host, you can see her on, as you're looking at your YouTube, I believe on your left, she's going to ask her a pretty important question, and I really wanted to play that for you as well, and the response.
You were there that morning. You experienced it for yourself, those crazy intense winds and those flames and the danger and the terror. Can you imagine not having the time to evacuate? Those hours were crucial in saving many of these victims, and they just went to bed thinking they were okay.
Absolutely. In fact, I was communicating with a friend while we were in the eastern part of Altadena, and we didn't see anybody out there as far as emergency responders. Very limited, I should say. Very few engines and not very many people. So I didn't know what was happening really in the western part of it, but I had a friend here who was helping, trying to evacuate people, and I can hear the urgency in her voice, just saying, oh, we're trying to get these people out. And that was at the same time at 3 a.m. Clearly, there were a lot of people that didn't know, and clearly a lot of people only had minutes to get out when they did hear of the fire.
So you can see the real world effect. The impact was devastating. Lives were lost. People went through that inferno that many who would have been able to get away because of the failure of the LA County to notify the folks in West Altadena. And they could have, they should have, but they didn't. It's just that simple. We're going to find it out. Now, I mentioned this. I already billboarded this for you. I already, highlighted it. But Altadena is the African-American side of town. And I don't want this to sound like I'm even implying that there was some, it had to do with the race, that the county said, hey, we don't care about the black neighborhood. We don't care about the black people. Let them burn up. I don't think that was what was going on. I honestly don't. But can you imagine if a similar story had played out in, say, Wichita or Kansas City or Austin, Texas, Republican state? Austin's actually a Democratic city, but Republican city. Can you imagine if the authorities had let the black side of town burn up without telling the residents while they had 9 hours earlier begun, or 8.5 hours earlier begun evacuation of white residents? Can you imagine what Democrats would be saying, what the libs would be saying? Can you imagine what your California Democratic activists would be saying if you saw this play out in a Republican city where the black neighborhood was allowed to be basically destroyed? Where at least many, many deaths where there were none in the white area? You would have such an outcry. You would hear cries of racism, of gentrification. Yeah, let's get rid of those poor residents. Let's get rid of those poor houses, and we're going to rebuild with real expensive McMansions. Altadena's in a real nice area. It's right on a big state park. It's right next to Pasadena, which is a very affluent area. It's pretty close to downtown. It's in the hills, so it's a little cooler. So this is valuable real estate. Is there some kind of plan to let this happen? Is this a disaster capitalism? 65 years ago, Altadena, all of it was white. And the reason is you couldn't even sell to black people because of these horrendous, evil covenants, which I guess I did know they had those in California. It's disgusting. It's despicable. But during the 60s, the covenants were declared illegal by the Supreme Court at that time. I don't think today's Supreme Court would make those illegal, but we had a better Supreme Court then. And as a result of that, the covenants being ruled illegal, and as well as a lot of other factors, including the riots, Altadena, experienced a significant amount of white flight, because those were the people who lived there. And where do they leave most particularly? West Altadena. And I'm going to assume that's because it was a little closer to downtown, which is where you had the riots. I don't know that. I'm just presuming. That may not be the case. So West Altadena, lost its pale complexion, became more African American in the 60s. And frankly, it remains that way today. In 1980, just show you real quick. As in 1980, more black residents live west of Lake Avenue, which is the area that didn't get notified until 9 hours had elapsed from the fire report. And 17 people died. Many houses were destroyed. That neighborhood is not all black by any means. It's integrated. But the fact that It's more African American. I'm going to assume, again, the housing stock isn't necessarily as good, as valuable. And, the developers are chomping at the bit. And, of course, Governor Newsom said, hey, go ahead, rebuild. There's going to be no environmental regs. We're not going to look over your shoulder. Do it however you want. That's a Democratic governor in a Democratic county. And let's hope, we'll keep an eye on this, let's hope they're not going to just leave those West Altadena residents hanging out to dry. But they might. Seems very plausible. Doesn't seem unreasonable. And you can see that Lake Avenue, and we saw even just west of Lake were some deaths. That's the area that didn't get the notifications. If you were west of Lake, your house was assigned from the 60s through the 70s to blacks. And if it was east of Lake Avenue, to the whites. Now the bigger problem isn't segregation. It's just those homes are more and more expensive. They're $1 million houses. 2 or 3 bedroom houses is $1.5 million. No more bargain. No more bargain. So what do? You want to sell houses? You're a realtor. You want to build new houses. You want to upgrade. You're an improver. You're a developer. Whatever you are, you're in construction. Hey, what gives you a better opportunity than a fire? And especially if the people who live in there, many of them have just decided we're going to move on. We're not even going to stay here anymore. Now, the fact that the notifications didn't go out doesn't mean the firefighters weren't there. In fact, you heard Michelle Vyas say, yeah, there were firefighters there. But how much damage occurred? How many people lost their belongings, their personal effects, some of which they could have saved? Their valuables that they could have transported out of the home very quickly. Didn't happen because the county didn't notify them. So was this somehow by design? I don't honestly believe that. I don't think so. But I bring it up because can you imagine what Democrats would say if this had happened in a Republican state, in a city that was run by Republicans, where the black side of town doesn't get notified for almost 9 hours of a devastating fire, when the white side got notified 8.5, 9 hours earlier? Can you imagine what Democrats would be saying? The point of this is not to even try to compare or say, oh, well, this or it's that we need to go in a different direction. This hyper-partisan, two-party, binary political system is toxic, and it leaves us all losers except for the leaders in those parties and the billionaire class. It's time to move on. All right, I'll be back tomorrow. I did not get to my discussion of sex and gender. I will do that tomorrow. Give me a little more time, a little more opportunity. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being part of Halitics. I'll see you tomorrow.